Locke wondered whether it's possible for matter to think, right? And that was considered blasphemy, because if matter can think, then that means our soul perhaps could dissolve when matter dissolves, and therefore we're not immortal. So you get someone like Catherine Coburn who comes in and she's considering it, and she really works to defend him, to say, why do we assume that immortality must be tied to something that is immaterial? We don't need to hang it up on that. These are questions that our mind is simply too weak to access. And so perhaps our immortality should be grounded on something very different than this apprehension of substances that Descartes laid out for us. So she turns to other principles that she thinks are more self-evident, that God is good and wise and we have reason. And so therefore this kind of guarantees that we will continue living after we die. I don't quite follow that argument, but that is her hope. But anyway, all this to say is that these women were very much interested in the metaphysical problems of their age, and not only in the question of woman and their condition.
What's up, everybody? From Nautilus, I'm Brian Gallagher, and you're watching Behind the Scenes. Today I'm speaking with Regan Penaluna. Regan is a writer and journalist based in Brooklyn, and the author of the new book, How to Think Like a Woman, 4 Women Philosophers Who Taught Me How to Love the Life of the Mind. She has been an editor at Nautilus and Guernica, where she wrote and edited long-form stories and interviews. And her writing has also appeared in places like the Chronicle of Higher Education, Philosophy Now, and the Philosopher's Magazine. She has a PhD in philosophy from Boston University and a master's degree in journalism from Columbia University. Her recent story in Nautilus was When Mary Wollstonecraft Was Duped by Love, a spotlight on the personal life of the trailblazing philosopher. Regan, thanks for joining us.
It's great to be here, Brian.
So to start off, could you summarize your intellectual and academic background for us, and also tell us what subjects are drawing your interest now as a writer and journalist?
Sure. So as an undergraduate, I studied philosophy and art history, and I went on to pursue my PhD in philosophy. And after that, I turned to journalism, and I got a master's in journalism also. And right now, I'm still deeply fascinated by philosophy. As a graduate student, I focused on the history of philosophy, and I love it. And now that I'm outside of academia, outside of philosophy, I focus a lot on biography, on literary works, and so my writing has really expanded in addition to journalism and reporting. So I'm really, I've become a really broad writer.
What areas of history of philosophy did you want to learn more about and focus on in particular?
So my area of specialization was early modern philosophy, which is the works of Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, Spinoza, think of those figures, Rene Descartes. And as a graduate student, I really wanted to do something new. And so my advisor suggested I looked at these more obscure figures in the history of philosophy. They're called the Cambridge Platonists, who I'd never heard of. And as I was reading one of their works, I was drawn to a monograph about him, this obscure monograph. And in the footnote of the monograph, it mentioned that this philosopher, Ralph Cudworth, had a daughter, Damaris Masham, who wrote philosophical treatises. And I was blown away by this fact, because I didn't realize that there were women philosophers before the 20th century. As a graduate student, focusing on the history of philosophy, I didn't run across women philosophers at all. And in fact, I hadn't studied any in graduate school, even in the 20th century, and I hadn't studied feminist philosophy. So for me, this was a major revelation, and it was really exciting. And I decided to focus my dissertation on that. And even after I left academia, I could not let these thinkers go. Mary Astle, Damaris Masham, Catherine Coburn, and in my postdoc research, I also turned to Mary Wollstonecraft. And they kept returning to me in my life. And so I decided, that I wanted to write a book about them and introduce them to the world.
All right. And once again, your new story in Nautilus is When Mary Wollstonecraft Was Duped by Love. Could you give us a brief summary of that story for our viewers who haven't read it yet?
Sure, it's an excerpt from my book, from the chapter about Mary Wollstonecraft. And she is a very interesting individual. Most people know of her, of the four women that I focus on in my book, but most people don't think of her as a philosopher. And I wanted to focus on her philosophy. And this story is about a moment in her life when she was going through a really difficult time. She had just given birth to her daughter, and the father of the daughter was Gilbert Imlay, an American from Kansas who had moved to England. He had written a novel, very intellectual individual, but also very much involved in the world and business. And he had met Mary, and she fell head over heels for him, which was surprising to her, because by the time she met him, she was already the famous author of A Vindication of the Rights of Woman and The Vindication of the Rights of Man. She was very well known to defend the French Revolution, to defend these ideas of freedom, of autonomy, of rights. And in these works, particularly The Vindication of the Rights of Woman, she talks about how women are made weak by society, and how through a poor education, social conditioning, women become what she called spaniel-like in the presence of men. They sort of behaved in ways that were intended to serve the needs and desires of men, and they would set their own needs and desires to the side, much like a dog. So when she met Imlay, she fell for him and started to behave in a way that was familiar to her, as she had described in her book, in the negative sense. And she found out that he had cheated on her not long after she gave birth to their daughter. And it was such a shock and such a tragic feeling that she attempted suicide. She obviously didn't succeed, and she and Imlay got back together again, and he asked her to go on a mission for him, a business mission, to go around Scandinavia and try to hunt down this money that he was owed by some ship captain. And Wollstonecraft was game, and she was game partly because she wanted to win back the heart of Gilbert Imlay, and she wanted him in her life, and particularly the life of their daughter, Fanny, who was her first daughter, not her second daughter, who we all know, Mary Shelley, who wrote Frankenstein. Mary Shelley isn't in the world yet. So she decides to go on this mission. But another reason she does choose to do this mission is for a much more positive feminist reason. And this is another description of woman that shows up in A Vindication of the Rights of Women. So we have this spaniel-like woman, one made weak by society, and we also have this other model of woman, one that is a construct of the feminist imagination, one in which a woman is free and she is using her intellectual skills and her talents in order to explore and understand the world in the same way that an autonomous male would do. And so this trip was serving sort of these two conflicting parts of herself, right? One is to win the heart of Imlay, and the other is to explore and apply these theories of Darwin's evolution, which she was very much interested in, theories of Rousseau and human nature, when she would go and visit and meet these people in Scandinavia who to her were very strange and different. And so she took this trip, and so that's sort of the setting of this story. And so I follow her along on this trip.
That's great. How did you, I mean, you explained a little bit how you began to be interested in some of these philosophers. Once again, there's Damaris Masham, Mary Astle, Catherine Coburn, and we just mentioned Mary Wollstonecraft. Why don't you briefly introduce each of them? I guess you can skip over Mary since we just discussed her.
Sure. So Mary Astle was born in 1666. She grew up in the north of England, and a very interesting person. She left home at age 22 after she discovered a few years before that she had no dowry. She grew up as a gentry woman. So having no dowry as a gentry woman was not a good thing in the world. It would mean you'd have to marry below you. And that was especially a devastating prospect for her because she hoped to continue to study. She wanted to live a life in books. She wanted to live a life devoted to writing. And as a young girl, an early teen, she actually had access to these things through her uncle, Ralph Astle, who tutored her in these subjects because he was tutoring her older brother. And sometimes this happened in relatively wealthy families that if the older male sibling was being tutored, they would just let the younger female sibling be tutored also. But this was very exceptional. So fortunately for her, she had this exposure, which just lit her up, gave her a purpose in life. And by age 22, she said, I'm going to leave home and I'm not going to marry. I'm going to be single by choice, not necessity, is how she put it, right? Not because no one wanted her, it's because she wanted to be single. And so she moved to London and she set out to be a woman writing philosophy, which to make a living off of it, which had never happened before in history, right? So there were women before her who had succeeded in making a living off writing. Aphra Behn is a famous playwright who a few decades before her did this. There were women doing philosophy before her in England also, but they were aristocrats, and so they didn't have to worry about whether their works would sell. Astle worried about this, and so she made it to London, and after a year of difficulty, she actually did succeed in finding a patron and finding a publisher. And one of these early works that she published is called A Serious Proposal to the Ladies, and I love that title for an early modern text. It's amazing. And it is a book intended for women, and it's essentially a text about the good life. You want to live a good life, women? Well, the good life is an intellectual life in which you get to indulge in the pleasures of the intellect like men have. And we will not be robbed of the tree of knowledge, she says. And so she lays out some principles that women can use. They're Cartesian, meaning Descartes. She was a fan of Descartes and innate ideas, and natural reason was a way to access truth. And so she provides a method that women can use in order to clear their minds and apprehend reality. So that's Astle in a nutshell. There's so much more to her. But Damaris Masham, who is a virtual contemporary of hers, was not a rationalist. She was an empiricist. And Masham grew up on the grounds of Cambridge University. Her father was Ralph Cudworth, a master at one of the colleges at the university. So she learned about philosophy from a very young age, through him, most likely. She does talk about being discouraged from it at a very young age, but she doesn't say who did. But she knew her father's philosophy very well. And she actually corresponded with John Locke about it. She corresponded with Leibniz about it. So she was very well adept at metaphysics. And she also eventually fell in love with John Locke when she met him at a party one year. He was over twice his age, and he saw her, and she's this beautiful, young, brilliant woman, and they hit it off, and it started this long correspondence between the two. And she agreed with him that all ideas are regained through experience, sensation, and reflection on the world. But she wasn't interested in getting into philosophy quite yet. And it took some time. And she ended up marrying someone else, I suspect because Locke didn't propose to her. And he had no need to. He was doing fine. He didn't need a woman in his life. Or a wife in his life, I should say. He did need a woman. He liked having women in his life. But it took some time, more experience in the world, and she became a mother and started to read the text of Nicolas Malebranche, this famous Cartesian philosopher of the time, who essentially argued that mothers are the origins of sin in the world, that confusion is essentially passed down through mothers to the children in their womb, and the only way to truth is to transcend our reliance on our senses, that we learn from our mothers, essentially. And so she read that and found that incredibly offensive. And she wrote a work, it's called Discourse Concerning the Love of God. And she defends the dignity of mothers in this. And she also defends them against what Locke says in her later work. Locke says that if you remember that all humans have a right to the pursuit of happiness, there's a sense of inalienable rights. He seems to extend this to women. And in the home, in the domestic sphere, he says the rights between parents should be shared equally. They have equal power over their children. And then there's one caveat. And he says, well, if mom and dad aren't agreeing, dad gets the ultimate say because, and he says, I quote, he's abler and stronger, unquote. And it's unfortunate. And Masham had a response to this. It was indirect. She never explicitly takes him to task, but she essentially says that mothers have the ultimate say in the home. So that's Masham. And then Catherine Cockburn, she was another British philosopher. And she wrote a novel or a novella when she was a teenager in defense of the freedom of conscience of women. She was very active in writing plays and play production in London at the time. And there were a few other female playwrights, and they were all sort of friends. It was a sisterhood, essentially. And all of their plays were aimed at elevating the condition of women in the minds of the audience. And it was a rough place to be a woman, and a play came out eventually that mocked all three of these women, including Cockburn, and that sort of was the slow end of her career. After that happened, she was less productive and less involved, and eventually left altogether, and she turned to philosophy. And she wrote a few very large philosophical treatises, and these are mostly defenses of John Locke, which I could get into a little bit. It's very interesting. But at the time, Newton and his sort of mechanical theory of the universe was widespread. And the question was, that Locke wanted to solve is, how can I describe a theory of the mind that is mechanical also and does not invoke the will of God, right? We need a more scientific theory of consciousness. And so that's what Locke does, right? He said that he describes the way of ideas that does not require invoking God at all. But the problem with that is that doesn't really gel much with the moral spirit of Europe at the time, which is Christian. Because if you don't need God in order to have your ideas, if all of your ideas are constructions based on sensations and reflections, right? Combinations of these things. How do you know that what you think actually reflects reality? And so Cockburn went in and tried to defend him and the skepticism that his ideas created about religion. I don't know how successful she was, but he very much applauded her efforts and wrote her a letter of thanks and sent her a check.
That's really cool. Were all these women philosophers aware of each other, and did they have a significant correspondence that you rely on and can talk about?
Sure. So I definitely got a lot into their letters and anything I could find in order to build these pictures of their their subjectivity. Astle and Masham definitely knew of each other, and I don't think they liked each other at all. They responded, there was a bit of backbiting in their works. Masham was really annoyed by Astle's proposal of creating an all-female academy. She thought that in order to access the truth, you don't want to remove yourself from the world. You don't solve these problems of sexism by withdrawing from the world. You solve them by actively participating in the world, even though it's a tough place to be. Cockburn and Masham were friends. I mean, they were, there was a generation that separated the two, but I know they walked together through Hyde Park in London, and they really admired one another. I mean, they were both advocates of Locke's empiricism. They both knew Locke, Masham obviously intimately so. He lived in her household at the end of his life, and I don't know how Masham's husband, felt about that, but I know that it was great for her and productive time for her philosophically. But yeah, she and Cockburn were good friends, and Cockburn supported Masham when there were accusations that Masham didn't write her treatises, which was, one of the many ways, still is one of the many ways that women's work is suppressed, is by arguing that they're not the true authors of the work. This was done to Masham. She wasn't the true author, it was Locke's, and or he really helped her with it. And so she actually publicly went out and said, no, Masham wrote these, she really did. None of them personally knew Mary Wollstonecraft. She was born 10 years after Cockburn had died, so they didn't personally know her.
Maybe we should briefly sketch the divide between the empiricists and the rationalists, since it seems those were some of the big issues they were grappling with. Sure.
And it gets a little sticky. So I could talk a little bit about this idea, dualism, the mind-body dualism of Descartes, right? Descartes had this idea that reality is composed of two substances. You have mind on the one hand, right, which is unextended and indivisible, right? And then on the other hand, you have matter, which is extended and divisible. You can chop it up, you can weigh it. So that seemed like a very simple way. He believed these ideas were very clear and distinct in his mind, and very simple way to argue or to articulate what reality is composed of. And so the question a lot of early modern thinkers grappled with is this true? Is this what really is reality? Do we need to accept this extreme dualism in Descartes? And these women were sort of on the fence, actually, about that extreme dualism. Even Astle, who adored Descartes, who advocated the women in her female academy that I talk more in length about in my book, that women read his treatises, she too was unsure about whether they are clear and distinct. And this is partly because of Locke and, his questioning of it. And so Locke wondered whether it's possible for matter to think, right? And that was considered blasphemy, because if matter can think, then that means our soul perhaps could dissolve when matter dissolves, and therefore we're not immortal. So you get someone like Catherine Cockburn who comes in and she's considering it, and she really works to defend him, to say, why do we assume that immortality must be tied to something that is immaterial? We don't need to hang it up on that. These are questions that our mind is simply too weak to access. And so perhaps our immortality should be grounded on something very different than this apprehension of substances that Descartes laid out for us. So she turns to other principles that she thinks are more self-evident, that God is good and wise and we have reason. And so therefore this kind of guarantees that we will continue living after we die. I don't quite follow that argument, but that is her hope. But anyway, all this to say is that these women were very much interested in the metaphysical problems of their age, and not only in the question of woman and their condition.
What are some of the other, or some of your favorite themes or arguments that these philosophers wrote about and tussled with?
Yeah. So my book, it focuses on the dimensions of their philosophy that I think are generally have been overlooked. And that is their discussions of women and the condition and how to improve the condition of women. So for, Mary Astle, I was drawn to her personally because she was, wanted to contribute to this conversation in the early modern period that was about what is the right sort of conditions in order to do philosophy and natural philosophy, which is another word for science, right? what do we need to do this? And so, Francis Bacon is like, well, you have to clear the mind of these idols, custom, opinion, authority. And Descartes was the same, and John Locke. And so you have these very huge thinkers, these very significant thinkers, even stepping away from the universities and getting together and creating their own societies. The universities were flooded with the ideas of Aristotle. And so they said, we need to have a place where we can think these things anew. And they formed these small groups, these groups in coffee houses. The thing is, women were not allowed at the university, right? Women were prohibited from studying at the universities. There's one exception, or a few exceptions. One was Anna Maria van Schurman, a Dutch philosopher, and the only way that they let her study there, I mean, she was a genius. She wrote like an Ethiopian grammar book. She wrote philosophical treatises. And they're like, okay, maybe she'll study here, but she has to sit behind a veil if she's going to do it. So she wouldn't disrupt the men. So she agreed. But generally, women were not allowed in these spaces. They were not allowed in these coffee houses, which actually Jürgen Habermas, contemporary philosopher, said these coffee houses are sort of this is where open discourse was happening. Sort of these critical moments in modern democracy were happening at this period, but women were not allowed. And so Mary Astle saw this, and she said, we need to create a space for women to cultivate their minds as is intended. They have reason. God does nothing in vain. So the conditions for women to do this have to be, a place where they have access to great philosophical texts, where they have access to a supportive network. And this is something that she thought the men took for granted. They weren't aware of how much they relied on that support of one another in order to think through their ideas. So I found that a really powerful notion in her thought, and I write about that. I talked about Damaris and her discussion of motherhood, which is really interesting. And Coburn, Catherine Coburn, so the playwright turned philosopher, I found her discussion of maternal ambiguity really fascinating. So after she had written her plays, after she had written these incredible defenses of John Locke, she was acclaimed. She got married and she had children. And for the next 17 years, she was entirely silent. Didn't publish anything. And she even wrote in a letter, she wrote a fan mail letter to her favorite writer at the time, Alexander Pope, who was older than her, but she adored him. And in this letter, which she never sent to him, but she did have preserved, she said, I haven't been working because I'm taking care of my kids, essentially, right? And she was like, I'm being a good mom. And so I always assumed that, okay, she was this incredible writer, incredible thinker, and then when she became a mom, she just gave it all up, trying to be a dutiful mother. And I found it puzzling because up until that moment, she had been talking about how important it was for women to be equals, for women to participate in these intellectual spheres, for men to take them seriously, for women to take themselves seriously in this way. And I thought, wow, really, her duty to being a mother just totally trumped that all like that easily, and that's it. And then I found in some great works of scholarship that actually Coburn was not silent. She was busy at work. She was thinking through her philosophical ideas. In fact, she was writing, it's really interesting literary work, a collection of fictional letters with conversations between women, reflecting on the frustrations, that they're having being mothers, frustrations with the men in their lives and how they wish they could be using, their minds more. And I saw this conflict in her. There's nothing to resolve it, right? But I saw it in her. And so I found that really interesting. And it does sort of map onto her philosophy, too, that she strongly believed that what brought society together wasn't just our selfish passions. And this was a response to Thomas Hobbes, whose philosophy of mutual advantage was the justification for why political society exists, or for what legitimates it. And she she did believe selfishness was important, but that wasn't the only emotion, and altruism was significant, and the care for others. So duty to self and duty for others are essential for holding society together. And her diagnosis for society at the time was that men are too selfish, and women are too altruistic. And so she wanted women to be a bit more selfish, and she wanted men to bring more compassion to the relationships to others, and particularly to women. So that kind of ambiguity, that pull between self and others, never will be ultimately resolved. But she does think that if men were more compassionate, it would take pressure off women, in particular mothers.
Same. Did you see any similarities in their kind of the origins of their interest in philosophy with your own? How did you become curious and passionate about philosophy? Well, why was that something you wanted to pursue in undergrad?
In undergrad, I wanted to get into philosophy because I wanted to know about God. I had grown up in a really, religious context, and I loved that kind of question. Is there a first mover? What is out there? Is this really all there is? What is the purpose of life? Like, how should I live? Right? As growing up as a Christian, you're always talking about the good life. It's like in your face, right? And by high school, I actually had left religion. But the questions about what's out there, is there a divine being, or is there an ultimate being, didn't ever leave me as an undergraduate. So that is why I was so into early modern philosophy. These guys are talking about those questions, right? Pascal and Descartes, and I found it fascinating. So that was how I got into philosophy as an undergraduate. By the time I went to graduate school, I wasn't so interested in those questions. Were you going to ask something? I'm sorry.
No worries. Yeah, I did have a follow-up question.
Yeah.
But yeah, just is the question of atheism ever come up for these women philosophers? Did they ever come close to that and kind of back away? I mean, it was a time where religion was very unquestioned. But do you suspect, like, if they had perhaps lived a little bit later, would they have come out as atheists? I mean, given how much religious justification went into the suppression of women's rights and kind of a misunderstanding of their capabilities?
It's a great question. There were atheist theories at the time, and that they were living, right? And Thomas Hobbes, sure, he talks about God, but listen, the guy is an atheist. Everything's material. You don't need a God in that world. And even Descartes, you can question his ultimate devotion to a divine being and the necessity of it. It's not required. And so atheism was definitely there. It was considered a threat. So I think God was questioned. The question was like, what is our relationship to God? And do we really need this being to really get on with our lives, right? It's the rise of science. It's like we're getting much better as humans in articulating our world without all this other kind of hocus pocus. But what I find so fascinating is that these women latch onto God. Like, I feel like they're holding tighter to this old way. And I always found that puzzling. But then I started thinking, I think I get it. I think I get why God is so crucial to their ideas. I mean, all four of them, Wollstonecraft, perhaps to a slightly less degree, but they all use God, invoke God, and his sense, this idea that God is good and wise, and therefore any women have reason, and so therefore they should use it. They all rely on this argument to justify women's participation in the world and in intellectual spheres, right? It's crucial. And I think the reason is because they don't trust that men will, what's the authority under God? Well, it's men. Well, they don't trust leaving it up to men. So they have this sort of trump card of God as a way to secure their place in the world. So would they have become atheists? I mean, I don't know. I don't know. It's so hard for me to separate them from that theological justification, that need.
Hmm. I know you are on book tour and stuff and talking about your book, but is there anything else that you're working on at the moment or thinking about starting another writing project or a piece
Hmm.
someplace?
Yeah, I am. I'm working on a couple of book ideas. Yes, more um, women from the past and
Mm,
bringing them to life. Yeah.
That's excellent. Um, I mean, this is kind of a big question, but I did want to touch on it. What what do you? I mean, if you're still keeping in touch with the world of philosophy now, how is the situation with women in philosophy, and what are some of the big questions that are being explored, particularly by women philosophers today?
Um, there are many more women philosophers participating in philosophy. It's really heartening to see. And I'm mostly in touch with women who are working in the history of philosophy and in resurrecting these voices of women philosophers. And there's just been an incredible blossoming of this over the last decade. And so it's just really great to see this network. And the ideas are just all over the map. It's women throughout history, different periods of time, contributing to the questions that are familiar to us, those in metaphysics and ethics, and those questions that are sometimes more marginal, although I think they should be more central to discussions of the good life and of humanity, which questions about the condition of women and so on. So it's very rich and diverse, and it's great.
And one more question related to that. So you talked about how these women were very interested in sort of the condition of women in the time they were growing up and what it could mean to live a good life and what could change to improve the lives that women could lead. But how do you see now the connection between what you describe as the life of the mind and living a good life? Are those two necessarily related, or I mean, is there kind of more of a pluralism where, I mean, you don't necessarily have to be someone enamored with the life of the mind to lead a good life? How do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I love The Life of the Mind. I think it's fantastic. But I definitely don't want to push it on anybody who is not interested. That would be ironic, right? I mean, no suffering should happen, at least, unwilling suffering. Um, you should, if you're going to work through Thomas Aquinas, you should, and suffer from that, you should enjoy, that. But so,
Mhm.
yeah, I mean, I don't, you know, I don't think it's necessary to live well. I come from it from a place where I do think that if you wish to live a life of the mind, if ideas do light you up, then may you have all opportunity to indulge in that, and may nothing be an obstacle to that path. And that's how why I identified so much with these women. I had struggles in academia with this. I felt there were some limitations on that, and I saw it in these women philosophers, which is one of the reasons that they resonated so much with me.
Hmm. All righty. To close, Reagan, do you want to tell our viewers where they can find you online? Do you have a website they can visit or follow you on any social media channels?
Sure. Yeah, I'm on Twitter at reganpenaluna.com, or not .com, Regan Penaluna.
All righty. Excellent. Well, Reagan, it's been a fascinating discussion. Thanks so much for sharing the ideas in your book and for having Nautilus excerpted. It was great.
Thanks so much, Brian. This was a lot of fun.